Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. In this episode, we're excited to bring you an interview with Professor Raffaella Baccolini of the University of Bologna, Italy. Before we tell you more about her and give you a sneak peek into our interview, we thought we'd introduce ourselves a little more fully to you and tell you a little bit about this podcast. Matt, why don't you kick things off for us?
Thanks, Liam, and thanks to anyone who's listening. We might just be talking to ourselves out there, I don't know yet, but whatever way, we'll have some fun. I guess I could start a little bit with a little bit about me. So I've taught at the University of Winchester on the English literature program for over a decade now, and my research interests lie primarily in utopian and dystopian fiction. I teach a third year module on the subject and a master's module on apocalyptic fiction, which is where I kind of started out as a scholar. My publication history is kind of eclectic, but in more recent years and in work I have that's sort of coming up in the pipeline, I really focused on utopian and dystopian fiction, and it's just an area I find endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, Matt, through talking with you, I know you've got loads in the pipeline at the moment, but is there maybe one piece of work in particular that you'd like to really spotlight right now?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I can't sell you anything because nothing's actually out there at the moment, but I've got a lot of stuff that I've been working on, particularly over the last summer. I've been writing a monograph. It's for Liverpool University Press. It's called Play in Utopian and Dystopian Fiction. It's pretty much done, just waiting on some comments from a colleague. And yeah, partly it's kind of about trying to challenge some of the ideas about utopian fiction being dull. So, one of those kind of critiques of utopias is that, the utopians are always boring, they work too hard, these kinds of things. And the monograph kind of starts out with that and thinks a little bit about how play operates in utopian fiction, and then sort of switches that on its head and thinks about kind of play, which quite often frequently turns up in dystopian fiction, that's often quite quite bad forms of play or not really play at all. It's sort of deadly games and these kinds of things. So that's really what the monograph's about. And what about you? Obviously, your interest in dystopia come from your PhD thesis that you've been working on. Can you say a little bit about that, Liam?
Yeah, so my sort of first introduction to utopian and dystopian fiction started probably where most people's does, which is with George Orwell. Looked at Animal Farm when I was at secondary school, and then read 1984 when I was at college. But then when I first started my undergraduate degree, one of the texts that we studied really, really early on was Thomas More's Utopia, and that really fascinated me. The idea that in a piece of fiction we could lay out a blueprint for a perfect society. So that idea sort of stuck with me for a while. And then at the third year of my undergrad, I studied a module on literary dystopias, where I was taught by Dr. Nathan Waddell. And that just really fascinated me. It's probably really poor of me to say, but for someone who studied English lit at university, quite a lot of the lit that I was reading really bored me. I wasn't really that fascinated or interested by it, but these sort of glimpses into utopian and dystopian visions really, really captured my interest, and that sustained me for a very, very long time. And yeah, just recently I've finished up a PhD in English lit at the University of Birmingham, where I look at 20th and 21st century literary dystopias and what I call their endotexts. So these sort of short additional texts found within those books. So the Newspeak appendix from 1984, for example, or the conference proceedings at the end of The Handmaid's Tale, or any example where you might see a letter or a newspaper article within a novel that both you and I can read, but maybe the characters can read as well. And in examining those endotexts, I've found that literary dystopias, as well as directly responding to their geopolitical and geohistorical contexts, are also responding to a broader genre-wide preoccupation with truth. And I think that's sort of the myth that maybe I'm debunking a little bit in my thesis. Is I'm looking at, yes, dystopias may be about their time, they may be about their place, but throughout the genre, they're also about truth. There's this sort of a contextual preoccupation with them too. So that's where I'm at currently. I've got one or two publications currently in the pipeline, but more in Orwell sort of studies, because you can't get away from Orwell if you're working on utopias and dystopias. But yeah, that's enough of me and my interests and sort of where I've been so far. But Matt, we're not just here to talk about ourselves, we're here to talk about our podcast. So, Matt, I wondered if you could give us a podcast origin story, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Although I'm not sure it's really an origin story that stays away from the talking about myself thing, but I'll go for it. Yeah, I suppose I should just say a bit about those origins, and it really comes from us meeting one another, albeit virtually. Like all good relationships, we started by meeting each other on Twitter, which is not really quite, I suppose, the utopian space it maybe was at the time now, but nevertheless, we try and make it a better space. Yeah, and at the time, I think you were doing your PhD in dystopian fiction, which, as you say, you've now completed. And so we obviously had a kind of shared interest there. But I also came across your work that you do on YouTube, and it got me thinking about sort of different ways to reach audiences. And one of the great problems of academia is that we feel inevitably like we're talking to a tiny circle of kind of people. And maybe this podcast will prove exactly that. Perhaps we'll have that kind of tiny audience, but it'll be fun whatever we do. But and yeah, maybe it's because I like the sound of my own voice. I don't know, but I thought, why not reach out to you and kind of have a kind of collaboration? And we actually did a video. I don't know when it was, mate. Was it 2 years ago now or something like that?
Maybe pushing 3 years ago now.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah. It was called "What is Dystopia?" It's on your channel. You can actually check it out if you're interested. It's basically just us chatting about what dystopia means, and I think when we started it, we were thinking it would be a, I don't know, 20-minute kind of chat, and we just ended up getting carried away, didn't we? And it ended up being about 50 minutes. I had a lot of fun doing that in that piece with you, and I thought maybe we should do some further collaboration. And I think the actual idea for the podcast came from the edited collection I've been working on, which is a book called Wastelands and Wonderlands: Essays on Utopian and Dystopian Literature and Film, which I'm hoping is going to be out through SUNY Press at some point next year, because the manuscript is done and it's in their hands. But anyway, the collection sort of aims were originally to challenge various myths about utopian and dystopian fiction, and so the original name I wanted to give the book was Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a kind of play on this idea of kind of myth busting ideas about utopia and dystopia in popular culture. But I can't remember how it happened actually, but I got talked out of that title in the end. But I couldn't let go of what I thought was a good title, so maybe we could make a podcast out of it. Um, but anyway, the main thing was I had the pleasure of working with some great writers in the field who gave me some fantastic essays, including Raffaella. And I thought, well, maybe there's a way I can further brutally exploit this poor group of utopian scholars, and the kind of network of friends and scholars that I'd kind of met during the process, and we have a go at doing something in a bit of a different format. So here we are giving that a go. Liam, might you say a bit about the kind of format of the podcast, how you expect it to kind of proceed from here?
Yeah, of course. And this is, I guess, for the benefit of our listeners right now who are maybe wondering, what are these two guys chatting about and when are we going to get to the interview? So each podcast episode will begin with a short discussion with Matt and I about the interview that will have happened, and maybe some related ideas. After which point there will be the interview itself with a sort of leading scholar, thinker, or writer in the field, whatever that might look like. aiming to debunk one of those utopian and dystopian myths. And then there might be a tiny bit of wrap up at the end. Now, this is at present a bit of a pilot season. Matt and I have completed 3 interviews at this point with some absolutely fantastic guests. And we do hope to expand and include more voices in future. So, if you like what you're listening and you want us to carry on doing what we're doing here, please do let us know. Another aim of the podcast is to give people ideas of things to read about, whether that is recommendations for pieces of fiction to read or maybe even watch, or whether that's pieces of criticism or sort of lecture recordings and so on, just to give people a broader idea of what is out there in utopian and dystopian studies, what they should be listening to, reading, watching, and so on. And generally just to, I guess, increase people's knowledge, awareness, and enthusiasm for a genre that Matt and I and our guests are deeply, deeply passionate about. So, Matt, I guess that's enough about the that meta discussion about who we are and what this podcast is. But Matt, you interviewed our first guest, and I wondered if you want to give us a little bit of a intro to the interview that you had with her.
Absolutely. I mean, as I already mentioned, it's a very long interview, so I suppose I'll let most of it speak for itself. But yeah, I was very fortunate enough to be able to sit down with Raffaella Baccolini. We had a pretty broad discussion about her work. And for those who aren't familiar with her work, she was really instrumental in what I guess is a kind of shift in utopian studies where suddenly dystopias were being discussed in a more intellectually rigorous kind of way. Most of the history of kind of speculative fiction studies has tended to focus on the utopia for various reasons, which we could, probably get into across the series as a whole. But I think Raffaella's work captured that moment when it turned on its head. She talks a little bit about that in the interview, and particularly her work with Tom Moylan, who, with the two of them, they kind of popularized this term, the critical dystopia, as a kind of way of thinking about a kind of hopeful dystopia that aims to maybe correct some fundamental flaw in the society of the writer. And yeah, in the interview, we also talk a bit about the chapter she's been writing for the collection that I mentioned. Her chapters on Ursula K. Guin's wonderful short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which I just cannot recommend to readers enough if you haven't already read it. It's only about 5 pages, well worth your time. And N.K. Jemisin's short story, which is a kind of response, which is called The Ones Who Stay and Fight. Anyway, I don't want to ruin the interview, but for the purposes of the podcast, I will also just say right out of the gate that she bursts one of the central myths about utopian and dystopian fiction that I think is worth talking about, which is this idea that these are kind of two opposites. And she very much is sort of talking about them as in some way one and the same, or kind of two sides of the same coin, if you like. So that's the first myth, I suppose, that we're kind of busting in that interview.
Yeah, and as editor, I have had the privilege of having a listen to the interview already, and it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, it is such a treat, a delight, a gift to have Raffaella on the podcast. And I know you mentioned fanboying a little bit in sort of your interview with her, and I think I echo you there that Raffaella's work, whether that's her independent work or in collaboration with Tom Moylan and other scholars, was really influential for me throughout my PhD. I think she was probably the sort of single most utopian or dystopian scholar that I cite the most in my thesis. And I've seen her talk at conference keynotes and whatnot, and she's just incredibly listenable. Like, she's someone who you want to listen to, and she says some really powerful things, I think, both in her work, her writing, other lectures and talks that I've seen that she's given, but also in this podcast here today in this interview. I mean, Matt, you talked a little bit about busting that myth that utopia and dystopia are opposites. Is there anything about that you want to quickly talk about in more detail before we hand over to Raffaella?
Only really, I suppose, to say that if it's a good myth to start with, and it's It's only partly planned that way. I mean, partly I think we wanted to speak to Raffaella first. But but also it is a great place to start because it's kind of in the name, utopian and dystopian fictions. We're already doing something which I'm kind of a bit uncomfortable with, which is separating these two sort of genres, if you like, out and perhaps placing them in opposition to one another. But I certainly in my teaching on the utopian and dystopian fiction module that I run, one of the first things I try to do is kind of say, well, there's a lot of overlap here. The two don't sort of aren't so easily divided. And one of my favorite things to do in classes is to essentially tell students that this horrible text that we're reading this week, this really awful, grim, brutal, is actually really kind of hopeful and is kind of utopian as well. And I partly do it, with my tongue in the cheek. But I mean, you mentioned already the appendix for 1984. 1984 is the quintessential grim, bleak dystopia that everyone thinks is just awful. And then you've got this random slice at the end of utopian hope, where if you read the appendix, and most people don't, most people, I think at least, stop on the final page and then don't read the bit at the end, which seems kind of formulaic and boring and technical. I can understand why, and quite long. Yeah, they miss out if they don't read it. They miss out on this great sort of kind of ending, which actually suggests that the regime is no more, right? So there are always these kind of pockets of hope in kind of the dark spaces. That's kind of what the critical dystopia is about, I think.
Well, Matt, I guess with us saying a little bit more about whether utopia and dystopia are they the same? Are they different? Are they two sides of the same coin? Are they part of a continuum? Is there maybe more grey areas than we'd like to normally admit? I think that's pass over to Raffaella.
First of all, I would like to introduce Raffaella Baccolini, and wonderful to have you here. Really delighted to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. I wondered if you could just introduce yourself to our audience briefly.
Okay, thank you for having me. So I would say that I'm Italian, first of all, and that I teach British and American literature and gender studies at the University of Bologna in a department for interpreting and translation. But a big part of my identity is also shaped by the fact that I studied, worked, and lived in the United States for several years. And so, I think that, my identity has been shaped, has been informed by the geographical, cultural, and political circumstances of this experience.
Brilliant. And also, I mean, the primary reason we've got you on here is because of your expertise in utopian and dystopian fiction. And so I wondered whether we might start with a really kind of, I suppose, in some ways, I suppose it's supposed to be a straightforward question, but in many ways, I suppose it's actually probably the most difficult question. And that is, what does that term utopia mean to you?
Yeah, that's not an easy.
I realized that as I said it, I thought, oh, this is actually probably the worst, the hardest question to ask. But yeah, sorry.
It is in a way. I think I would say that I like and I agree with Lyman Tower Surgeon's definition of utopia as social dreaming. I like that. And thus I connect utopia with words like desire, choice, change, resistance. So the belief that the world can be radically changed. So utopias, I use utopias for both utopia and dystopia in a way. Dystopian texts are repositories of hopes and dreams that are both individual and collective. So whether utopias present frightening or liberating futures, imperfect societies. I think they are both for writers and readers, sites of resistance, sites of opposition, of revision of the present, okay, and therefore also starting point for an effective chance to change that present and create a better future.
I think that's really interesting because you're already sort of talking about utopias and dystopias quite interchangeably there, and I would I before I sort of met you via working together on this edited collection that I'm currently working on. I came across your name before that, and particularly in connection with the idea of the critical dystopia. And it's I think perhaps I don't know, you might correct me on this, but perhaps it's unfair to say this, but I think your name is most associated with that, and with your work with Tom Moylan on the concept of the kind of critical dystopia. So I wondered, maybe if you might say a little bit about that term in particular. How did it come about? What perhaps is it about that term you think that has interested people, captured their attention? Because at least from my perspective as a scholar of utopia or dystopia, that's one term that I certainly teach my classes, and that sort of resonates with people.
Well, as a matter of fact, when I started working, maybe I'll do a step back. I did my training first in Italy and then in the United States, and of course, I came across the usual Thomas More's Utopia, William Morris News from Nowhere. But they didn't really excite me. I found, the work of George Orwell, Brave New World by Huxley, and I was also majoring in Russian at the time. So I read Zamyatin's We, and I thought those were a lot more interesting, a lot more intriguing. They were speaking to me in a way. So, but when I continued my work in the United States, I did my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation on modernism, on an American poet, HD, and so, I didn't have time for utopian studies. I liked dystopias, but, it was something that I read for fun in a way. And it wasn't until 1986 when a friend gave me The Handmaid's Tale as a present for my birthday and as a distraction from, writing my dissertation. That's when I started thinking, more kind of scholarly about dystopia. And the reason is that, I really found Atwood's novel refreshing, intriguing, interesting. But I read reviews at the time, and critics were really criticizing her because she didn't follow the conventions of the dystopian genre. So they wrote they didn't think it was a successful dystopia, or that dystopia did not apply to it. And for me, it was exactly the opposite, because I was working on revision of genre and how genre intersects with gender in HD's work. I was so steeped in the issue, in the theme of revision, that for me, Atwood's work was a clear example of a feminist revision, of an intervention on genre. And so that's how I started working on dystopias. And in particular,
just to intervene though, I think that's really interesting, because I think these days, most sort of people come across Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, and it's now sort of just seen as the quintessential,
Exactly.
dystopia. It's difficult to imagine a time, I suppose, when it was just sort of, had just come out, where people would think like that. But it is, I suppose, in many ways, it's sort of regarded in a similar fashion as Orwell's 1984, but it is quite distinctive and different, I suppose, in its own right. If you sort of think about Huxley, Zamyatin, and Orwell, there is a sort of coherence there that Atwood does depart from, too much to her credit, I think.
Exactly, and it was exactly that departure, in a way, that intrigued me. And as a matter of fact, as I worked on the conventions of dystopia, and how women writers were changing those conventions. The one thing that struck me was the ending, the open ending, the ambiguous ending, that really breaks away with the tragic ending of Brave New World of 1984. And as a matter of fact, in the first article where I started talking about critical dystopias, which is the gender and genre article that came out in a collection edited by Marlene Barr in 2000. I wasn't sure whether to call them open or critical dystopia, because that openness was really what the element that best explained the criticalness of those works. And then, together with Tom and the other people that contributed to Dark Horizons, then we chose the term critical dystopia.
Which obviously sort of follows on from other sort of categories that had already sort of, the critical utopia, presumably, that it was a response to.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that criticalness. I mean, one of the questions for me was, how are critical dystopia, or how is the criticalness of critical dystopia different? But it's exactly that openness, ambiguity, that makes them, in a way, the works that maintain a utopian impulse.
Yeah, I was talking recently to Sean Seeger, who was sort of talking about sort of pessimistic utopianism, and I suppose in some way it's a kind of a counterpoint to that, isn't it? It's the kind of optimistic dystopianism, in some way, the idea that the dystopia also represents kind of possibilities, or the possibility of hope, which is something that I suppose you could argue is left out of something like 1984. Although I would kind of, I mean, I've spoken about this before as well, but obviously I kind of I try to convince my students anyway that there is a kind of hopeful ending for 1984, which is the appendix that most people sort of skip over, sort of, which implies, that the regime doesn't sort of survive in some way. But you're right. Most people stop on the kind of final page and think, yeah, that's pretty bleak. but maybe I'm just an optimistic reader. I don't know, but I hope you won't mind me.
And at the same time, it's kind of interesting because it's kind of the opposite, or not exactly the opposite, but in Atwood, the appendix as the function of showing that Gilead, does not continue, but at the same time, it's revelatory of a kind of patriarchal system that is still.
Right, yeah. It's not the total defeat of the idea, it's just
right.
the sort of end of the regime. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I hope you don't mind me fanboying, I suppose, for a minute, but I remember reading Dark Horizons when as a kind of postgraduate student, and it had a real impact on me, I think. It's a really great collection. It's got a host of really prominent voices, but I particularly was struck by the first chapter, which at the time I was researching on sort of post 9/11 fiction, and just the first chapter is a back and forth between Ruth Levitas and Lucy Sargison about kind of utopia, and they're sort of discussing this and the sort of epistolary kind of fashion, letters to each other, and then 9/11 happens sort of midway through this, and it's such a moving and powerful piece, and I think it just does so much to show. I think part of the point of critical dystopia is really, which is kind of that historical element, how how these texts are responding to their kind of historical moment, and to see these kinds of critics responding in real time, if you like, to a kind of live event like that. I just thought it was fascinating, and one of the best pieces of criticism I've ever read. And I fanboy because it's in your book, but I know it's not you you that's written. So written it, but I just it's a great collection, but that was really impressive. And I think I just wondered as well, when you edited that collection, it seems to me at least that the field was kind of relatively in its infancy. I
Yeah,
think since then it's really kind of exploded to some extent, along with the genre.
along with the
Um,
genre, exactly.
when you were writing that, did you have any kind of sense that there was real potential in this subject area, or was it kind of just something you were interested in? Did it feel like it was breaking new ground?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I think there was room for discussion of dystopia, but I didn't expect this explosion of dystopias themselves.
Mm.
So much so that I think right now I'm a little concerned about the amount of dystopias that are coming out. There's certainly a commercial dystopia out there, especially, and that's something that worries me to some extent. The dystopias written for young adults.
Mm.
There's been so many, starting with, of course, Hunger Games,
Mm.
trilogy, Divergent, all these trilogies and so forth. And they tend to be a little too uh, compensatory,
Mm.
right? Reassuring.
Yeah,
Uh,
positive endings, happy endings,
yeah,
Hollywood style. Yeah.
Hollywood style, right? And I mean, for me, the idea of good literature, just good literature in general, but especially when we talk about dystopia, is a text that disturbs you, unsettles you. I
Challenges the status quo
Yeah,
in some way. Yeah.
I like those books that raise questions rather than provide answers, and and I find these commercial enterprises, marketing enterprises, a little too compensatory and a little bit too reassuring, even on themes like climate change, which is such a big issue these days. A lot of the Hollywood style kind of works tend to be reassuring in that there's a scientist, a father, some sort of figure that will save the day. And that's not exactly what will happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. To be kind of cynical about it is a kind of very much an industrial process going on, isn't there? And I'm kind of struck by how everything has to be the new Handmaid's Tale or the new Hunger Games or the new
Sure. Mhm.
1984. Pretty much every text is being badged in that way, and it's actually
Mhm.
sort of quite reductive in some way. There's actually, there is some quite formulaic material being written, but there's also some really interesting stuff that kind of just gets shoved into that bracket. I remember seeing on one of my modules, I teach. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, which is a wonderful novel, and a Japanese novel that I think is written in the 1990s, but recently translated, relatively recently, I think 2017 or something like that, into English. And because it's called The Memory Police, everyone wants to say, well, it's the next 1984. It sounds
Mhm.
very similar. It's just totally different. It's really heartfelt, emotional. It's got many more layers than I think 1984 has. Um, and yeah, it's just nothing like 1984, and it kind of frustrates me that perhaps people would pick that up and to the point where the actual translation of the Japanese title or something like I think it's The Secret Crystallization or something, and they've used the name The Memory Police specifically to evoke kind of Orwell. So I kind of I definitely agree with you that this sort of commercial endeavor is, has its sort of downsides as much as it has produced a lot of interesting fiction for us to engage with and read.
Mhm.
Um, I wonder if you might comment. So you've obviously been recently writing a piece for the collection that I mentioned, and you've chosen to write about Ursula K. Le Guin's famous 1970s short story, "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas," um, and the 2018 riposte to that by N.K. Jemisin, which is called "The Ones Who Stay and Fight." And I'm conscious that listeners may or may not have read either of these stories. Probably not the Jemisin story, but maybe the Omelas. But I wonder, A, what drew you to those texts, and B, what you think is why they're particularly relevant today, perhaps.
I was actually looking for. I'm always looking for interesting short texts to teach, and I usually try to to get my students to read some science fiction, even if the class is not a science fiction class. It's a general literature, and so I'd already worked with Le Guin in the past, and because it's such a brilliant story, nothing much happens. It's kind of a philosophical story where a society is described, not even in very specific ways, but it's like what appears to be a utopia. But it's a utopia. By the time you reach the end of the story, it's a utopia for some of the people, based on the at a great cost for somebody else, and in particular a child. The greatness of that society is based on the suffering of one individual, one child that is kept in a kind of prison. Um, and I had used that story once again in a kind of dialogue with M. Night Shyamalan's film The Village,
Mm.
because once again, to me, that story is so good, is so brilliant because it chooses the costs of living in what you may consider a utopia or not, which is the element of choice, which is missing from The Village. You see this society that looks like they live in the 19th century, but they actually live in a preserve. And so the young people of this society don't know that out there, there's a whole different world, and they live as if they are in the 19th century. So the element of choice is missing from that intentional society, which, of
Is it
course.
that the cost of the utopia of kind of their community is the withholding of knowledge of the
Yeah.
outside world is the kind of thing, yeah.
Mhm.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it, that I kind of probably should have probably prefaced a lot of this with spoiler alerts, because I mean M. Night
Right.
Shyamalan's films
Well,
are well
exactly.
known for their
I
twists.
spoiled.
Yeah, no, which is good. I think that you're right. The twists are really important in these texts, as it is with Omelas, right? So that it's that
Exactly.
moment of twist.
There's a twist. So as I was saying, I had already worked with Le Guin and with Omelas in particular. But this time it was a class on point of view, as a theme and as a rhetorical device in a way. So I found Jemisin as a response to show the different point of views. And Jemisin is, again, it's interesting how critics and readers have read this story. Oftentimes they've read it as a rebuke. I like to see it more as a dialogue, but it's modeled very much on Omelas. So it also shows, a utopian society where there's no room for, or let's say that there's room for the knowledge of the past of our world, but that knowledge has to be kept out, otherwise it will corrupt.
We are the corrupting force,
Yeah.
if you like, of their utopia, and particularly it's our intolerance, right, toward minorities that is, or to any other, I suppose, that is the corrupting force, right, to their utopia, which is in that sense very different to Le Guin, who I suppose, could be I don't think is a fair criticism, but might be lumped in with the kind of second wave feminists, a too white kind of, a white middle class sort of feminism, and this is kind of updating it, perhaps. I don't really like that criticism because I think it's kind of quite reductive, but I suppose this might be seen as a response to that, as a kind of 21st century update.
And so both work, I think they're very interesting. I think even though, since they're, utopian texts, or, they are very much, related to the time in which they were produced. So of course, Le Guin's is a product of, the discourse of 1960s, 70s counterculture, the Vietnam War, the idea that, you either love or leave America. If you don't like it, just leave. And I think that Jemisin has updated, in a way, that argument, showing the climate in which, her story is steeped, which is the Black Lives Matter movement, the systemic racism, violence, climate justice, or injustice, and so forth. So they're very, but as I was saying, despite this, specific time frames, I think they're both extremely timely. What I find very useful and very timely about these texts is the implication of the reader. The fact that they, in a way, invite the readers to make a choice. What would you do in that situation? And so once again, we're going back to that idea of literature that disturbs you, that unsettles, that, doesn't make you feel at home. And I like that because it's, kind of literature that invites, to do something, to think critically. I think that's the best that literature can do, in a way.
I wondered if you wouldn't mind telling us, are you currently working on something at the moment, in relation to kind of utopia, dystopia, or?
Yeah, we are in the process of finishing what is called a dystopia reader, together with, we have a group called the Dystopia Project, or the Dystopia Collective. I like the Dystopia Collective more than the Dystopia Project. It's headed by Patricia McManus, that you know. And other people that are involved in this collective are, of course, Tom Moylan, myself, Phil Wegner, Jennifer Lawler Wagner, Darko Suvin, Anthony Spalazopoulos, Mark Bold, Lawrence Davis, and I'm forgetting somebody, I'm sure, Joe Davidson, Hilni Cavalcanti from Brazil. So some of the people that, of course, are also present in Dark Horizons and Utopia Method and Visions, and other works that we've done. So it's combination. So it's divided in two parts. So the first part is reprint of our early work. So my 2000 article, parts of Tom's book, and the introduction and conclusion to Dark Horizons. And then there's a chapter by Tom and myself where we, in a way, in a dialogue, look at our collaboration over, it's been 30 years now, because we met in 1993, so it's been 30 years of collaboration. And then the second part is all new work, starting from, that early work. Where does dystopia go? The problem of anti-utopia, the problem of commercial dystopia, and so forth. So, the rest is new work by, these people, Trish, Phil, Antonis, and so forth. So that's, one big project. And then, the other project is not really on utopian studies, but I'm about to start a 3-year project funded by the Creative Europe program on gender positive literature. So it will have, dystopian science fiction in that as well. But it's, it's the continuation, actually. I already led 2 similar projects in the past years. We did the first online bibliography of gender positive literature for children aged 3 to 10, and then teens aged 11, 14, and now we'll be working on the target group 15, 18. So dystopias will be
Yeah, I can
part of that.
imagine, particularly that age group. Yeah, it sounds really great and fantastic. Sounds like you're also very busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us. As a kind of sign off, I am asking all of our guests, what is a text? Could be a novel, could be a movie, or a piece of criticism, perhaps about utopia or dystopia, or perhaps in your case, that you think everyone should read or watch. Have you got any kind of recommendations?
Only one?
Yeah,
that would be my can I cheat and say one piece of criticism and one novel?
yes, absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
Okay,
Only because it's
so
you. Only because it's you. But yeah.
no, so piece of criticism, I think any students who approaches utopian studies, I tell them to read Lyman Tower Sargent's Three Faces of Utopianism Revisited. So I think, that's a must. And then as literary texts, for personal reasons, I would say Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, just because it has changed my life in a way.
And that's where our interview with Raffaella came to a close. I'm sure you will all join me in thanking Raffaella for her time. It was really great to hear about how she first got into utopian and dystopian fiction, her current thoughts and concerns about the genre, and her analysis of Le Guin's and Jemisin's work. If you liked what you heard here today, don't forget to follow the podcast, rate it on Spotify, or get in touch on our email, which is utopian and dystopian fictions, all one word, at gmail.com. We've got loads more exciting chats coming soon, so make sure you listen out for those.